The drums began before the sun, a sound not of celebration, but of judgment. It was a low, guttural heartbeat that pulsed from the distant mesas, rolling across the arid plains and seeping through the chinked logs of the small cabin. It was the sound of a promise being called due. Boone Carter was jolted from a shallow, sweat-soaked sleep, not by the sound, but by the silence that followed it. The rhythmic thunder ceased abruptly, leaving a ringing void that felt more menacing than the noise it replaced. He sat up, the rough wool blanket scratching against his bare skin. The other side of the bed was cold, empty. The morning light, still pale and thin, sliced through the single window, illuminating a scene of quiet desertion. Ayanna was gone. Her wedding dress, a soft doe-skin garment, intricately decorated with river pearls, and turquoise, lay in a heap on the floor, a pale ghost in the gloom. It looked less like it had been taken off, and more like it had been shed, discarded like a skin that no longer fit. His head throbbed, a dull ache behind his eyes that fogged the edges of his memory. He remembered the ceremony, the stern, assessing eyes of her father, Chief Takakota, the barely concealed contempt of her brother Kuruk, the towering, graceful presence of Ayanna beside him, a woman who seemed carved from the very rock and canyons of this land. He remembered the sacred cup, the bitter herbs, the weight of their traditions settling upon him. Then, a blur, an argument, fear, a profound, gut-wrenching shame that had no clear shape. His eyes scanned the room, searching for something to anchor the fractured pieces of the night. Then he saw it. Not scattered beads, but something far more personal lying on the rough-hewn floor near the discarded dress. A small silver locket tarnished at the edges, hanging from a delicate chain. He had given it to her 3 weeks ago, a token from his world, a clumsy attempt to bridge the gulf between them. She had never taken it off. Now it lay on the floor like a final severed connection. He lurched from the bed and scooped it up. The metal was cool against his palm. His thumb found the small clasp and flicked it open. As he stared at the empty space where a picture should have been the memory of their last conversation, crashed down upon him sharp and brutal. Asterisk. This is from your world. Ayanna had said the night before, her voice quiet, but edged with a tension he hadn't understood. They were alone in the cabin, the sounds of the Apache celebration fading outside. She held the locket in her palm, her long fingers tracing its engraved floral pattern. It is beautiful, but it is empty. Asterisk, asterisk. It's for you to put a picture in. He'd mumbled, already feeling the walls of his commitment closing in. Of us. Asterisk, asterisk. She had looked up, her dark eyes pinning him in place. They were eyes that had seen battle, that had read the turn of the seasons in the flight of a hawk. They saw more than he ever wanted anyone to see. Or perhaps she said, her English precise and formal. It is for a picture of the person you left behind. The one whose memory makes you look at the horizon when you think no one is watching. The one you have never spoken of. Asterisk, asterisk. The sour taste of fear filled his mouth. There's no one. Asterisk. Asterisk, is there not? She pressed her voice, losing its softness. You carry a ghost, Boone Carter. I can feel it. I agreed to marry a man, not his shadow. The Apache do not build a life on secrets. Asterisk. He had turned away, unable to meet her gaze, the tremor starting in his hands. He had given her silence, and in that silence, she had found her answer. He had waited until the rhythm of her breathing deepened into sleep, and then he had done what he always did when the ghosts of his past drew too close. He had prepared to run. He hadn't made it far, just to the porch where he'd collapsed into a drunken, cowardly stupor, the decision made. But the action unfulfilled. She had not waited for him to wake. She had left the locket and gone. Now clutching the silver trinket, he stumbled outside into the stark morning air. The world was unnervingly still. His horse was gone. But it wasn't the silence or the missing horse that made his blood run cold. It was the sight on the ridge to the east, silhouetted against the rising sun. 3 figures on horseback, their forms sharp and clear in the crystalline desert light. Even from this distance, he recognized them. Chief Takakota, his frame as unyielding as the land he ruled. Beside him, the formidable shape of Kuruk, a man whose animosity toward Boone was a palpable force. And between them, mounted on a powerful war pony, was Ayana. She was no longer a bride. She wore the buckskin and leather of a warrior, a rifle resting in the crook of her arm. She looked as if she had come not to retrieve a husband, but to pass sentence. Behind them, fanning out along the ridge, were 20 more riders, their painted faces grim and their lances catching the first rays of the sun, like shards of obsidian. They were not a wedding party. They were a war party, and they were all looking at him. The silence was broken, as in perfect unison, they began their slow, deliberate descent toward his cabin, a wave of retribution that could not be outrun. The blood-red mesas glowed under the unforgiving sun, and the wind whistling through the canyons like a mournful spirit. The 20 warriors formed a perfect silent semicircle 50 yards from the cabin, a living wall that blocked any thought of escape. Every detail was sharp with menace, the nervous flick of a horse's ear, the soft creak of leather, the way a warrior's hand rested casually patiently on the hilt of a knife. Chief Takakota dismounted, his movements measured and heavy with the gravity of his purpose. He was a man etched by time and sorrow, his face a map of battles won and children lost. Ayana swung down from her horse with a fluid grace that belied the rigid set of her jaw. Dressed for war, the tomahawk at her belt was not an ornament. It was a tool she knew how to use. She did not look at Boone, but her disappointment was a physical presence, a cold spot in the warming air. Boone's gaze, however, was drawn to Kuruk, who remained mounted. A sly, predatory smile touched Kuruk's lips as he watched Boone's discomfort. His English, when he chose to use it, was sharp and laced with a wit that cut deeper than any blade. He was not just an angry brother. He was an architect of this moment. "Boone Carter, Chief." Takakota's voice boomed across the clearing, a sound like rocks grinding together. It was not a question, but an accusation. "You have brought shame upon my daughter. You have brought shame upon my people." Boone's hands trembled. He fisted them at his sides, the silver locket digging into his palm. He tried to speak, but the words were dust in his throat. He could feel the weight of their judgment, the collective stare of 20 warriors, who saw him as something weak and pathetic. I can explain," he finally managed, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Ayana turned her head, her gaze finally meeting his. The betrayal in her eyes was so profound, it almost buckled his knees. "Explain," her voice was cold and clear, each word a perfectly aimed dart. "Explain how you swore a sacred oath before my people and my ancestors, only to abandon your wife before the sun had risen on your first day. Explain how you made me a leader of warriors, a fool in the eyes of our tribe." He took a half step down from the porch, his boots sinking into the soft dirt. Shame burned in his gut, a sour, sickening heat. He couldn't meet her eyes. "I wasn't ready." He stammered, his gaze fixed on a loose stone near her feet. It was too much. The ceremony, the expectations. Kuruk let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "Ready," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "You were ready enough to ask for my sister's hand. You were ready enough to speak the vows. And you were certainly ready enough to drink from the ceremonial cup that bound you to our laws. Your readiness, it seems, only failed you when it was time to be a man." The memory of the cup returned, not just bitter herbs, but a ritual of blood and spirit, a binding of lineages. He had accepted it all. And then, like a thief in the night, he had tried to steal himself back. Among my people, Chief Takakota continued his slow advance, closing the distance between them. When a man takes a wife, he becomes her shield. Her honor is his honor. By casting her aside, you have not merely insulted her. You have declared her worthless. You have stolen her, standing her future. Boone's heart hammered against his ribs. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "What we want." Ayana answered, her voice trembling with a tightly controlled fury, "is for the insult to be answered. We want justice." Takakota stopped a mere 10 feet away, his presence immense. His eyes, dark and ancient, seemed to strip away every lie and excuse Boone had ever told himself. "There are 3 paths before you now." Boone Carter, the chief, said, his tone grim. "The first path is one of honor. You will return with us. You will live in Ayana's dwelling under Apache law as her husband. You will forsake your world and become one of us forever." The word forever hung in the air, an impossible weight. "The second path," Takakota went on, "is the path of blood. You will face my son Kuruk in trial by combat to restore the honor you have stolen. He will fight for his sister. You will fight for your life." Boone glanced at Kuruk, who was now slowly, deliberately cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a long, wicked-looking knife. The message was clear. Certain death. And the third way, Boone's voice was barely audible. Ayana stepped forward, positioning herself beside her father. Her face was a mask of stone. "The third way," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, "is the way of cowards. And cowards do not get to choose how they die." His mind reeled, trapped between 3 impossible futures. Live as a stranger in a foreign world, die a brutal death at Kuruk's hand, or be cut down where he stood. I need time to decide," he pleaded, the words tasting of desperation. Kuruk slid the knife back into its sheath and swung his leg over his horse, landing silently on the ground. He stalked forward, his movements fluid and dangerous. "Time," he sneered, stopping beside his father. "Time is a luxury for men with honor to spare. You, I believe, are quite poor." "Enough," Takakota commanded, raising a hand to silence his son. The chief's gaze settled on Boone, and for a moment Boone saw not just a stern leader, but a weary father caught between his duty and his daughter's pain. A man who flees his responsibilities, forfeits the right to choose his fate. "But Ayana, my daughter has asked for mercy." Boone looked at Ayana, searching for any sign of the woman he thought he knew, the one whose laughter had echoed in this very cabin. There was nothing. "What mercy?" he asked. "You have until sunset," Chief Takakota declared. "Not to choose, but to prove you are worthy of a choice. If you can show us that a flicker of courage exists within you, the courage of a man who understands the depth of what he has broken, then, and only then, will the choice be yours." "How?" Boone asked, bewildered. "How can I prove that in one day?" It was Ayana who answered, her voice cutting through his confusion. "You will come with us," she said, turning on her heel and walking back toward her horse. "You will ride into our home as a shamed man. You will see the faces of the women who were once my friends. You will hear the whispers of the warriors who once followed my command. You will witness firsthand the wreckage you have made of my life. And then perhaps you will understand what courage is truly required to fix it." One of the younger warriors trotted forward, leading Boone's horse by the reins. Boone's legs felt like lead as he walked toward it, the eyes of the war party burning into his back. As he swung himself into the saddle, he was no longer a landowner, a settler, a man of his own making. He was a prisoner trapped in a cage of his own cowardice. The journey to the Apache reservation was not a ride. It was a pilgrimage of shame. They bound his hands loosely to the saddle horn, a gesture that was more symbolic than practical. It declared him a captive, untrustworthy, a man who could not be allowed the freedom to guide his own horse. He was forced to ride bareback, the coarse hair of the animal chafing his legs, a constant grinding reminder of his debasement. They offered him no water, and the sun beat down with a relentless fury, baking the dust of the trail into a gritty film on his skin. Kuruk rode beside him, a silent, menacing shadow. For the first hour, he said nothing, content to let the heat and the humiliation do their work. But as they passed a dried-up riverbed, a place of bleached stones and cracked earth, Kuruk finally spoke. His voice, low and intimate, meant only for Boone. "Does this dust remind you of that day by the San Pedro River, Carter?" Boone's head snapped up. His blood ran cold, a glacial fear that had nothing to do with the Apache warriors surrounding him. The San Pedro River, a name from a past he had buried under years of solitude and liquor. Asterisk, a chaotic flash of memory. The roaring confusion of a mining camp. Shouts in languages he didn't understand. The glint of gold dust in a pan, the glint of steel in a man's hand. He was younger then, reckless, his temper a short fuse. An argument over a claim, a dispute that had spiraled violently out of control. An Apache family, a miner, and his 2 daughters caught in the middle. "I don't know what you're talking about." Boone lied, his voice hoarse. Kuruk's smile was thin and cruel. "Don't you? I find that hard to believe. A day like that, a man tends to remember it. The shouting, the girl who tried to stop the fighting." Asterisk. Another flash, sharper this time. A young woman barely 16, with eyes as dark and fierce as Ayana's. She had stepped between him and another miner, her hands raised, pleading for peace. Her name was Leta. He remembered her name. Boone squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the image, but it was seared into his mind. He saw the shove, the clumsy, accidental fall, the sickening crack of her head against a discarded piece of mining equipment. The sudden, horrified silence that fell over the camp. The way her father had knelt beside her, a terrible animal wail tearing from his throat. He had run, not just from the camp, but from himself. He had changed his name from Boone Callahan to Boone Carter, moved territories, and built a fortress of solitude around the rotting guilt in his soul. She had a name, Kuruk whispered, his horse moving so close their legs brushed. Her name was Leta. She was my younger sister. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Boone stared at Kuruk, the pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed slotting into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just about Ayana's honor. This was older, deeper. You knew who I was all along. Boone breathed the realization, sucking the air from his lungs. From the first day you came courting my other sister, Kuruk confirmed, his eyes glittering with a cold, triumphant hatred. I recognized the coward's eyes from the San Pedro, the same eyes that watched Leta die and then vanished into the dust. It took me years to find you, Carter. Or should I say Callahan? The entire marriage, the peace treaty it was meant to secure, it had all been a trap, a meticulously crafted stage for Kuruk's revenge. My father is a man of peace, Kuruk continued, his voice a venomous hiss. He believes in treaties and words. I believe in justice. I knew what kind of man you were. I knew you would run. And I knew that when you did, you would give me the perfect excuse to demand satisfaction. An excuse even my father could not deny. They rode on Boone's mind, a maelstrom of shock and dawning horror. He was not just a coward who had abandoned his bride. He was a man who had been herded into a pen, waiting for a slaughter he had unknowingly set in motion years ago. The journey was no longer about shame. It was a slow, agonizing march toward a fate that had been hunting him for a very long time. The Apache reservation was a sprawling collection of hide dwellings and horse corrals nestled in a protective crook of the mesas. As they rode in, a palpable wave of contempt washed over Boone. Women turned their backs, pulling their children away, as if he carried a disease. Men stopped their work to stare, their expressions a mixture of pity for Ayana and unvarnished disgust for him. He was a pariah, the living symbol of a white man's broken promise. But now, seeing it all through the lens of Kuruk's revelation, Boone's perspective shifted. He was no longer just observing his shame. He was investigating his own execution. He watched Kuruk, who moved through the village, not as a grieving brother demanding justice, but as a political operator, stoking the fires of dissent. He saw him speaking in low, urgent tones to a group of young, aggressive warriors, men known to be impatient with Chief Takakota's peace policies. He saw the exchange of knowing glances, the clenched fists, the simmering anger that Kuruk was expertly channeling. Ayana, bound by her own sense of dishonor, remained aloof. She spoke to no one, her face a stoic mask. Yet Boone started to notice small things. The way her eyes would occasionally follow her brother. A slight frown when she overheard a snippet of his inflammatory rhetoric. She was shamed, but she was not blind. Her warrior's instincts were still sharp. For 2 days, Boone was quartered in a small, isolated dwelling, treated as less than a ghost. He was given food and water, but no one spoke to him. He spent the time watching, listening, piecing together the true nature of Kuruk's plan. The whispers weren't just about Ayana's dishonor. They were about the inherent untrustworthiness of all white men, about the weakness of a chief who would bargain with them. Kuruk wasn't just seeking personal revenge. He was orchestrating a coup using Boone's cowardice as the catalyst to shatter the peace treaty and seize power. On the third afternoon, Boone saw the final piece of the puzzle. From his dwelling, he watched Kuruk practicing behind the horse corral. He was not using a standard knife or tomahawk. He was practicing with a set of 3 perfectly balanced throwing knives, their blades curved like a hawk's talon, their handles wrapped in distinctive red and black leather. Boone felt the breath catch in his throat. He had seen a knife just like that once before. It had been lying in the dust of the San Pedro mining camp near Leta's still form. At the time, in the chaos, he had assumed it belonged to one of the other miners. But now he knew. It had been Kuruk's. Kuruk had been there that day. He hadn't just been a distant grieving brother, he had been a witness. Later that evening, as Ayana brought him his meager meal of dried meat and corn, their eyes met across the small fire. For the first time, he saw not just betrayal in her gaze, but a flicker of uncertainty. She had seen him watching her brother. He took a risk. "The knives your brother uses," he said, his voice low. "The ones with the curved blades. Are they common among the Apache?" Her eyes narrowed. "No," she said slowly. "They were a gift. From a trader." "Why do you ask?" "I saw one once," Boone said, holding her gaze. "A long time ago, by the San Pedro River." The mask of stoicism on Ayana's face finally cracked. A storm of confusion and suspicion brewed in her eyes. She knew the story of her sister's death, or at least she knew Kuruk's version of it. Boone's words planted a seed of doubt, suggesting a narrative she had never considered. She said nothing more, taking the empty food bowl and leaving him in silence. But as she walked away, he saw her glance toward the corral where her brother still practiced, and for the first time, a fragile, unspoken alliance began to form in the space between them. The time for judgment had arrived. The tribal council convened at sunset. The elders gathered in a solemn circle around the central fire. The flickering flames cast long, dancing shadows on their weathered faces, faces that held the history of their people. Boone was brought to the center of the circle to hear his fate. He knew the options laid out by Takakota were a formality. Kuruk had whipped the tribe into a frenzy. The only acceptable outcome was blood. "Boone Carter." Chief Takakota began, his voice heavy. "You have seen the shame you have brought upon our village. You have been given time. Have you found the courage to choose your path?" Boone looked not at the chief, but at Kuruk, whose face was a mask of righteous fury, a masterful performance for the council. He knew accepting a life with the Apache was no longer an option. Kuruk would never allow it. His only path was the trial by combat. "I have," Boone said, his voice clear and steady. "I have stolen honor from this family. The only way to restore it is with blood. I will face Kuruk in combat." A murmur of grim approval went through the council. Kuruk's eyes lit with a predator's glee. He had won. He stepped forward, ready to accept the challenge and finally take his long-awaited revenge. No, the words spoken with absolute authority cut through the tension. It was Ayanna. She strode into the center of the circle, her head held high, her warrior's presence undeniable. She placed herself between Boone and the elders. "This is no longer about my honor," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. She turned and fixed her gaze on her brother. "This is about his." A stunned silence fell over the council. "For days my brother has spoken of the shame this white man has brought upon me." Ayanna continued, her voice gaining strength. "He has used my pain to stoke the anger of our warriors. He has used this insult as a reason to question the wisdom of our chief and the value of our peace. But I have watched him. I have listened. And his anger feels older than one broken vow. His hatred feels rehearsed." Kuruk's face tightened, the mask of the aggrieved brother slipping. "Sister, your shame has clouded your mind. This man is a coward who—" "He is a coward," Ayanna interrupted, her eyes flashing. "But he is not the only one in this circle with secrets. Today he asked me about the knives you carry, brother. He said he saw one like it years ago by the San Pedro River." The name hung in the air, thick with unspoken history. Chief Takakota looked from his daughter to his son, a deep, troubled crease forming on his brow. The pressure was too much. Kuruk's carefully constructed facade shattered, and years of repressed rage and hatred erupted to the surface. He lunged forward, his face contorted in a snarl of pure venom, pointing a trembling finger at Boone. "He killed her." Kuruk screamed, his voice cracking with a grief that was for the first time undeniably real. "This man, this Callahan, he killed our sister, he killed Lita." The council erupted in shocked gasps. The name Callahan and the truth of Boone's identity sent a ripple of disbelief through the elders. It was at the mining camp. Kuruk raged, the words tumbling out in a torrent of confession. "A fight over nothing. I was there, I watched him push her. I watched her fall, and he ran. He ran like the animal he is, and left her to die in the dirt." Chief Takakota stared at his son, his face ashen. "You were there, Kuruk? You told us you only heard the news from a scout." "I lied." Kuruk spat, his chest heaving. "I was too ashamed. I did nothing to stop it. I watched my own sister die. But I swore on her body that I would find him and make him pay. I orchestrated this marriage. I chose him for Ayanna because I knew his cowardly heart. I knew he would break his vow and give me the cause I needed to demand his life and end this cursed peace with his people once and for all." The revelation fell like a thunderclap, reframing everything. The dishonored bride, the demand for justice, the threat to the treaty, it had all been a lie, a grand and terrible theater of vengeance. The fight was never about Ayanna's honor. It was about Kuruk's guilt and his unquenchable thirst for revenge. Boone was not just a coward. He was a pawn in a decade-long vendetta. And now the truth was out, and the circle of firelight had become a courtroom for two men's sins. The council was in turmoil. Kuruk's confession had exposed a rot that went far deeper than one broken marriage. It was a personal vendetta that threatened to plunge the entire tribe into war, a betrayal of the community for the sake of one man's haunted past. Chief Takakota rose to his full height, his face a mask of sorrow and command. The weight of leadership seemed to press down on him, aging him in an instant. He looked from his son, consumed by a hateful grief, to Boone, the unwitting catalyst for this chaos. "The spirits of our ancestors cry out at this deception." Takakota's voice silenced the murmurs. This is no longer a matter of a bride's honor. It is a poison that has infected the heart of our tribe. Kuruk's personal vengeance has been masked as communal justice. Boone Carter's past crime has been brought into our present. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the elders. There is only one path that can cleanse this poison. Words will not suffice. A vote will only deepen our division. The truth of what happened at the San Pedro River died with Lita. Guilt and innocence can only be proven now by the Great Spirit. He raised his arm and pointed toward the highest mesa that loomed over the reservation, its flat top silhouetted against the darkening sky. The sacred ground of judgment. At dawn, Boone Carter and Kuruk will meet there. They will fight a duel to the death. Not for Ayana's honor, but to let the spirits decide which man's path is just. The victor will have his truth affirmed. The loser will answer to his ancestors. This was not the trial by combat Kuruk had wanted. That would have been a simple execution sanctioned by tribal law. This was different. A formal sacred duel changed the narrative. It was no longer a righteous warrior punishing a coward. It was two tainted men seeking a violent spiritual resolution. The tribe was now split. Some warriors loyal to Kuruk and his aggressive stance saw the duel as his rightful chance to avenge his sister. Others, particularly the older generation loyal to Takakota, feared that Kuruk's obsession would lead them all to ruin, regardless of the duel's outcome. They saw a man willing to sacrifice the peace his father had painstakingly built for a grievance he had hidden for years. The preparations began immediately, conducted in a tense, somber silence. Ayana, her face unreadable, prepared 2 sets of weapons, a knife and a tomahawk for each man. She was no longer a victim in this drama, but a keeper of its grim tradition. As she handed Boone his weapons, her fingers brushed his. "He is the greatest warrior in our tribe," she said, her voice a low whisper. "He fights with rage. It makes him strong, but it also makes him blind. Do not fight his fight. Fight yours." It was the first piece of guidance of anything approaching support she had offered him. He looked at her, understanding that her world had been upended just as much as his. She was now forced to arm one man she had loved against another she had tried to. Her honor was now inextricably linked to the outcome of a battle between 2 men, both of whom had profoundly wronged her. Boone took the weapons, the cold weight of the steel, a grim promise of the morning to come. He was no longer fighting for his life out of fear, but for a sliver of redemption he never knew he needed. The sacred ground of judgment was a flat, windswept mesa, a disk of stone floating in a sea of clouds. The air was thin and cold. To the west, a cauldron of bruised purple clouds was gathering, promising a dust storm before noon. The duel had to end before the storm broke, before nightfall, a ticking clock set by the heavens. Boone and Kuruk faced each other in the center of the mesa, stripped to the waist, their bodies painted with the symbols of their purpose. Kuruk's markings were aggressive, sharp, angry lines of black and red. Boone's, applied by a solemn elder, were simpler symbols of atonement and truth. The stakes were absolute. Boone's life, Kuruk's revenge, Ayana's future caught between the two, the peace treaty hanging by a thread. And for Boone, the final desperate chance to prove he was more than the coward of the San Pedro River. Chief Takakota stood at the edge of the mesa. "Let the Great Spirit be the judge," he declared, his voice carrying on the wind. With a sharp chop of his hand, the duel began. Kuruk attacked with explosive fury, a whirlwind of motion. His tomahawk and knife were a blur, forcing Boone into a desperate defense. Kuruk was stronger, faster, and fueled by a decade of simmering hatred. Every swing was a killing blow, every feint a prelude to a deadly strike. Boone, outmatched in skill, was forced to rely on pure survival instinct. He gave ground using his wits, anticipating Kuruk's rage-fueled patterns. He was not trying to win. He was trying to endure. The storm crept closer, the wind whipping dust into their eyes. The sky grew dark, turning the world a sickly shade of yellow. "You took everything from me." Kuruk roared, lunging forward. His knife sliced Boone's arm, and blood welled dark against his skin. "She was innocent. You brought your white man's greed and violence to our lives, and you left her dead." "It was an accident," Boone yelled back, parrying a savage tomahawk blow that would have split his skull. "I never meant for her to get hurt." "Lies," Kuruk screamed, his attacks becoming wilder, more reckless. It was the opening Boone had been waiting for. As Kuruk overextended on a powerful swing, Boone sidestepped and used his opponent's momentum against him, tripping him. Kuruk tumbled to the ground, his knife skittering across the stone. Boone was on him in an instant, the point of his own knife at Kuruk's throat. It was over. He could end it. But Kuruk, pinned and defeated, began to laugh. A raw, chilling sound that echoed across the mesa. "Go on," he rasped, a bloody smile spreading across his face. "Kill me. It doesn't matter. It's already too late." "What are you talking about?" Boone demanded, pressing the blade harder against his throat. "You think this was my only plan?" Kuruk choked out, his eyes alight with a mad triumph. "While the tribe was distracted watching this little drama, I sent 20 of my most loyal warriors on a different path. They rode out before dawn. As we speak, they are preparing to attack the Henderson settlement. The first shot will be fired by sunset. Even if you kill me, the war will begin. My sister will be avenged one way or another. The fire has already been lit." A wave of nausea washed over Boone. The Henderson settlement, families, children, people who had nothing to do with his past sins. He was trapped in an impossible moral dilemma. He could kill Kuruk, the man responsible for Leda's death in spirit, and the architect of this new bloodshed, and satisfy the duel's terms. Or he could subdue him, spare his life, and get the information needed to stop the slaughter. The first gust of the storm hit them, a wall of wind and sand that stung their skin. In that chaotic moment, Boone made his choice. He was done running from the consequences of his actions. He would not be a coward again. He slammed the hilt of his knife against Kuruk's temple. Kuruk's eyes rolled back and his body went limp. The duel was over. Boone had won not by taking a life, but by choosing to save others. The storm broke with the fury of a vengeful god. Boone dragged Kuruk's unconscious body to the edge of the mesa, where Takakota and a handful of elders were taking shelter behind a rock outcropping. He sent a war party. Boone gasped, the wind tearing the words from his mouth. To the Henderson settlement. They planned to attack at sunset. Takakota's face hardened, the personal grief for a son's betrayal eclipsed by his duty as a chief. He looked at Boone, who stood battered and bleeding, but resolute, and saw not the weakling who had shamed his daughter, but a man who had made a choice for the good of the people, both his and theirs. The race against time began the moment the storm's fury abated enough to ride. Kuruk, bound and gagged, was left under guard. Ayana, her authority as a war leader instantly restored by her brother's treachery, moved with decisive speed. Her voice crisp and commanding cut through the chaos. "Hona Tani, get the fastest horses, you ride with me," she ordered, pointing to 2 of her most trusted warriors. Then she turned to Boone, her eyes meeting his with a new startling intensity. There was no room for personal history, only the urgent present. "You know the land around the settlement better than we do. You will guide us." This was his transformation, made real. He was no longer a prisoner or a defendant, but a partner, a leader. He nodded, grabbing the reins of the horse, brought for him his actions, driven by a clear and desperate purpose. Alongside Ayana and her warriors, he thundered down from the mesa, leaving the wreckage of Kuruk's vengeance behind them. They rode with a singular, punishing focus. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of blood, and fire a grim reflection of what they might find. Boone pushed them through hidden canyons and across dry riverbeds he knew from his years of solitary ranching, his knowledge of the terrain saving them precious minutes. He and Ayana moved as one, a seamless unit forged in crisis. She would read the signs of the trail, and he would anticipate the lay of the land ahead. They were no longer a white man and an Apache woman. They were two leaders with a single objective: prevent the bloodshed that both of their pasts had nearly unleashed. They found the rogue war party concealed in a rocky arroyo, less than a mile from the Henderson homestead. The warriors were painting their faces for the final time, the light of the setting sun glinting off their rifle barrels. They were moments away from attack. Ayana did not hesitate. With a sharp cry, she spurred her horse forward, Boone and her two warriors right behind her. They burst into the arroyo, not as an attacking force, but as an undeniable authority. The warriors, startled, scrambled for their weapons, their faces a mixture of confusion and defiance. Their leader, a hard-faced man named Cale, stepped forward, his expression hostile. "Ayana," he snarled, "this is not your concern. This is the work of warriors avenging the honor Kuruk spoke of. Kuruk is a traitor who lied to you all." Ayana's voice boomed with the power of her father's command. "He used my shame and his sister's memory to advance his own quest for power. He has been defeated in a sacred duel. Our chief has declared his path unjust." As she spoke, Boone dismounted and walked toward them, unarmed, his hands held open. His face was bruised, his arm was bandaged, but his gaze was steady. "The man Kuruk wanted to kill was me," Boone said, his voice carrying over the tense silence. "The war he wanted to start was based on a lie. If you attack that settlement, you are not fighting for Apache honor. You are fighting for one man's bitter crime. The blood you spill will not be for justice. It will be for nothing." His presence, standing beside Ayana, was a more powerful testament than any words. The white man who was the cause of the insult was now riding with the chief's daughter to prevent war. The narrative was broken. The warriors looked at each other, their certainty wavering. Kyle hesitated, his loyalty to Kuruk warring with his respect for Ayana and the weight of tradition. Seeing his chance, Boone pushed one step further. "Don't let his hate become your legacy," he urged, his voice dropping to a plea. "Don't let the first day of a new peace be marked by the graves of children." It was Ayana who delivered the final decisive blow. "Go home," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Return to the reservation and hear the truth from our chief's own mouth. Or stay here and die as traitors to your people. The choice is yours." The standoff held for a long, breathless moment. Then, one by one, the warriors lowered their weapons. The fire for battle had been extinguished by the cold, hard light of truth. They turned their horses and, without another word, began the silent ride back home. The war was over before it began. In the days that followed, justice was rendered with solemn Apache grace. Kuruk was not executed. Vengeance was the poison they were trying to purge. At Ayana's own request, he was exiled, sent to live alone in the barren lands to the south, to confront the ghosts of his sister and his hatred in solitude. The peace treaty with the settlers was reaffirmed, now stronger than ever, cemented by the story of how a chief's daughter and her white husband had ridden together to prevent a war. Boone and Ayana returned to the small cabin, the space no longer feeling empty or haunted. It was now a place of quiet truth. Their relationship, born of a political arrangement and nearly destroyed by lies and fear, was being rebuilt stone by stone on a foundation of mutual respect. One evening, as the desert sky turned a soft violet, Boone sat across from her by the fire. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver locket. He had carried it with him through the entire ordeal. He opened it and this time slid something into the empty frame. He handed it to her. Ayana took it, her fingers tracing the tarnished silver. She looked inside and saw a tiny faded photograph, its edges worn from years of being hidden in a wallet. It was a picture of a young woman with dark, laughing eyes and a braid of black hair over her shoulder. It was Leda. "I was Boone Callahan," he said quietly, the words of his full confession coming without hesitation. "I was young, and I was reckless. I didn't push her to kill her. I pushed her to get her out of the way of a fight she was trying to stop. It was clumsy, stupid, and it killed her. I ran because I was a coward. I've been running from her face my entire life." Ayanna looked from the picture to his face, and for the first time, she saw all of him. The guilt, the shame, and the man he was struggling to become. She closed the locket and handed it back to him. "A person is not defined by the ghost they carry," she said softly, "but by what they do to give that ghost peace." The next morning, they rode out together, not east toward the reservation, but south toward the San Pedro River. They found the overgrown spot where the old mining camp had been a place of rust and ruin. There, by the side of the slow-moving water, they worked all day. They gathered stones from the riverbed, smooth and gray, and together they built a small, sturdy cairn, a memorial to the girl whose life had been cut short by a moment of foolish violence. As Boone placed the last stone on top, he felt a weight he had carried for a decade finally lift from his soul. It was not an ending, but an atonement. It was the beginning of a new life. Not as a white man living among the Apache or an Apache wife living with a settler, but as two people from different worlds building a new one together, founded not on a fragile peace treaty, but on a hard-won truth.